The mansion stood at the edge of town, looming against a sky heavy with clouds, the kind of place that seemed ancient even before you set foot inside. I was hired to house sit it for the next week, something about the owners needing to be away on business and they'd left the place in my hands. I wasn't exactly sure why they chose me, but the pay was good and I wasn't one to turn down an easy job. I pulled my car up the long driveway, the wheels crunching against the gravel as the mansion came into clearer view. It looked just as old as I expected, ivy crawling up the stone walls, windows that had been shut tight for years, and a door that seemed far too grand for something so empty. There was something unnerving about it, but I dismissed it as nerves, not wanting to look too deep into it. The door creaked open on its own when I turned the handle, and inside, the house was just as grand as it was from the outside, though dust and neglect had left their mark on everything. The smell of something I could recognize but not exactly know what it was filled the air. The furniture, though covered in sheets, was clearly expensive. It was hard not to feel the weight of the place, like it was watching. I had barely gotten my bags inside when a voice called out from the corner of the room. A woman, pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years, standing by the stairs. I blinked. She wasn't there a moment ago. She said nothing, just watched me. I felt the urge to speak, to ask if she needed something, but the words died on my tongue. Something about the way she looked at me made me hesitate. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't moving either. I just stood there, unsure of what to do, and then she vanished as quickly as she had appeared. My pulse quickened, but I chalked it up to fatigue, nerves getting the better of me in a strange place. I pushed the incident out of my mind and tried to get settled in. The night fell quietly, too quietly. It wasn't until the next morning that I discovered the rules. I was going through the kitchen, trying to find a decent breakfast, when I came across a letter left on the dining room table. It was handwritten, the ink neat and careful, as though it had been written by someone who wanted to make sure their words were followed precisely. As I read through it, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The letter explained everything, the conditions of my stay, the things I needed to do, the things I should not do. It was simple enough, though the tone was more serious than I expected. I started to read aloud as I went over the rules, almost as if the words themselves would somehow make more sense if I said them out loud. Rule 1. Once you enter the mansion, you must not attempt to leave before your stay is over. If you step outside before then, you will see someone standing at the gate. Do not approach them. Do not speak to them. If they raise their hand and wave, run back inside immediately and lock the door. They are more dangerous than you think. Rule 2. There is a large painting of a woman in the dining room. You must greet her every morning and say goodnight before bed. If she is not facing forward when you see her, turn around and leave the room. Do not look back. If you forget to greet her, your experience here will only get worse for you. Rule 3. If you hear a voice calling your name from outside after dark, do not respond. If it calls a second time, turn off all the lights and hide. If it calls a third time, it's already inside. Rule 4. You may hear a granny-like voice calling from the other side of a closed door. If it asks, "Is anyone there?" do not answer. It already knows the answer. Rule 5. If you hear someone crying in the next room but know you are alone, you must try to fall asleep or pretend to be asleep immediately no matter where you are. There is a high chance that whatever was crying will come to your room to see why you didn't fall for its trap. If it sees you asleep, it won't do anything to you, and it may only try again later. Trying to check up on it when it is crying or not pretending to sleep immediately would be the end of you. Rule 6. If you ever find the mannequins bleeding through their eyes and mouth, you must clean it up immediately. If you do not clean the blood in time, whatever is inside the mannequins will break free and come for you. Rule 7. If you ever come across a strange figure standing still in your path, do not try to get around them. The moment you do, they will begin to move with you, always a step behind. The last sentence hung in the air like a warning bell, but there was nothing to do but follow the rules. I could feel my heart racing a little faster now, my mind trying to make sense of the strange instructions. I glanced up at the painting in the dining room. There it was, the woman's eyes staring back at me, intense and unblinking. I didn't understand what kind of place I had walked into, but I did my best to push aside any lingering doubts. The first day passed without much incident, just the usual creaks of an old house settling, the wind against the windows, the kind of things that felt normal in a place like this. But by the time evening rolled around, I started to hear things, small noises that didn't fit. Like a shuffle, a dragging sound from the floor above me. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself that old houses often make noises, but the sounds didn't stop. They were persistent, like someone was moving around up there, pacing. I looked up the stairs, but nothing. No one. The silence crept back, but not entirely. Later that night, I went into the dining room. The woman in the painting was facing forward, just as she should, but something felt different. I greeted her as the rules dictated, and when I went to leave, I felt a cold chill brush against my neck. It wasn't normal. The house wasn't this cold. My footsteps echoed as I left the room, the house falling back into an eerie silence. Sleep didn't come easily that night. It felt like I wasn't alone in the house, even though I was. The old place seemed to watch, and that was the feeling I couldn't shake. I woke several times, the feeling of being stared at, though nothing was ever there when I looked. The next morning, the painting seemed a little different, the woman's expression darker, her eyes almost following me. But I greeted her like I was supposed to and went on with my day, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong. The rules were unsettling, but I still didn't fully understand why they were necessary. Still, I was determined to stay. The money was good and the house had a strange pull to it. What could go wrong, right? The days bled into each other in a strange, surreal way. I found myself walking the long hallways more often than I'd expected, wandering from room to room, not sure what I was looking for, just seeking some kind of comfort in the sheer size of the mansion. The silence was the worst part. No voices, no sounds of life. Just the occasional creak of floorboards beneath my feet, the wind pushing at the windows like a reminder of how alone I was. The longer I stayed, the more I began to notice subtle things. It was as if the house was slowly shifting around me, not in obvious ways, but in ways that unsettled me just enough to make me second-guess everything. I'd take a drink of water, and when I set the glass down, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow moving across the hallway or a figure standing at the edge of a room. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. I'd dismiss it as my imagination or maybe the old house's quirks. Yet it felt like something was waiting just beyond my line of sight. One morning, after I'd greeted the woman in the painting for the second time, I decided to head upstairs. The house's top floor was mostly untouched, the rooms locked up with old furniture draped in sheets, looking like they hadn't been lived in for decades. I didn't even want to imagine what it must have been like when the mansion was in its prime, perhaps a place full of life, laughter, and noise. Now it just felt dead. I wandered into a room at the end of the hall, one that seemed slightly different from the rest. The air was heavy in here, and the windows were shut tight, casting the room in an oppressive darkness even though it was still early morning. I stood in the center of the room, trying to decide if I wanted to keep exploring. Then, without warning, I heard a soft sound. It was subtle at first, like a scratch or a tap, but it came from behind the door. I stood still as I stared at the door, but nothing happened. The sound didn't repeat. I shook my head, thinking again that it was just the house. Maybe it was just old pipes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Later that evening, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I figured it was probably just a neighbor, someone curious about the new house sitter. I went to answer it, my hand hovering over the handle. When I opened the door, I was surprised to find no one standing there, but the air outside was unnaturally cold, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped out onto the porch, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, scanning the yard. Nothing. No one. Just the vast emptiness of the land surrounding the mansion, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't explain why. There was no reason to be on edge. The door behind me creaked, and I snapped my head around, only to find the door had swung wide open. I had to remind myself to follow the rules, to stay inside, and keep to the schedule I'd set for myself. That night, I went to bed late, too restless to sleep easily. It wasn't the kind of unease that kept you up, but more of an odd sensation that something wasn't right, yet I couldn't place it. I turned off the lights and eventually fell asleep. I woke up at what felt like the dead of night. The sound of the wind had picked up and it was whistling through the cracks of the house, but there was something else. I couldn't make it out. It was a low murmur, almost like someone whispering, but no words were clear. It seemed to come from deep inside the house. Slowly, the whisper grew louder, as if it was closing in, moving towards me. It made my skin prickle. I pulled the covers up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to calm down, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew closer, almost unbearably close. It felt like it was just outside my room now, creeping in with each passing second. I couldn't take it anymore. I cracked my eyes open slightly, glancing towards the door. I could swear I saw the faint outline of someone standing there in the darkness, though they hadn't made a sound. Just standing, watching. I squeezed my eyes shut again. I couldn't let myself move, and I somehow fell asleep. The morning came slowly, and when I finally opened my eyes, I felt more exhausted than before. But I was fine. The house didn't feel any less strange. I kept up with my routine, following the rules, doing what I was told. But the unease started to build. There were times when I felt the floor creak under a weight that wasn't mine. But whenever I turned, there was nothing. No one. Just the house, heavy with silence. I had a strange feeling, as though I were being watched even when I was alone. The house was big, but the tension was growing. It was like something was slowly closing in on me. The more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the rules, to not think about the consequences. Something about this place was wrong, but I didn't want to seem crazy and jump straight to conclusions. The days became harder to distinguish from one another as I settled deeper into the house. Each room blurred into the next, a series of monotonous spaces filled with shadow and dust. The air was thick, like a blanket that clung to everything, and the stillness was becoming unbearable. My thoughts grew more fragmented, distracted by the quiet hum of the house, the strange way the walls seemed to breathe, if only for a moment. I followed the rules as best I could, despite how unnatural they felt. I'd say good morning to the woman in the painting every time I passed the dining room and good night before bed. But the odd thing was she never seemed to stay in the same spot for long. At least that's how it felt. Sometimes when I'd return to the room, I'd catch her face turn slightly as though she had shifted while I wasn't looking. I had no proof of it, no physical evidence, but the sense of it lingered in the back of my mind, the unease creeping in. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself avoiding certain parts of the mansion. The grand staircase, for example, felt too steep to climb. I began taking the long route to get to my rooms, avoiding the grand hallway where the floorboards always creaked a little louder than they should have. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the house settling in the night. But there were moments when I'd feel a coldness on my skin, like someone had just passed by. The rules kept repeating in my mind as if I needed to constantly remind myself of them. Don't leave before your stay is over. Don't approach the person at the gate. Don't speak to them. Don't answer the voice calling your name. And then, late one evening, the air grew unnaturally still, a stillness that pressed down on me from all sides. It was like the house itself had gone silent, waiting for something. I was in my room, attempting to relax, but the tension in the air made it impossible. The rules rattled in my mind. That was when I heard it. Not a knock or a tap or even a whisper. It was the faintest of sounds, scraping, like something dragging across the floor. It was subtle at first, but it began to grow louder, more insistent, until it was clear it was coming from the direction of the dining room. My heart skipped a beat, my legs frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. I thought about the painting. Was she facing forward? I didn't know, and that uncertainty ate at me. I stood up and walked toward the door, my feet barely making a sound against the floor. I peered down the hallway, my breath shallow. The scraping continued, dragging against the wooden floorboards. The dining room was just at the end of the hall. I was sure I hadn't heard the sound before, but I couldn't be certain. It had to be her, the woman, but something was different. The sound grew closer as I made my way toward the dining room, my steps slower now and my body tense. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. Slowly, I pushed the door open, just enough to peer inside. The woman's painting was still there, but it was the way she was positioned that made my stomach churn. She wasn't facing forward. Her head was tilted to the side, her eyes, dark and cold, staring into the distance. I backed up immediately, feeling the weight of the room press against me. I did what I had to do. I turned away. I couldn't look back, not even once. I left the room and didn't stop walking until I reached the far end of the house, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on her face. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, and this house wasn't as empty as it seemed. Later that night, when I was in bed trying to force sleep on my restless mind, I heard it. Not a voice from outside, not a knock, but a soft scraping again. This time it was much closer. It was coming from inside the room. I lay there paralyzed, too scared to move, listening as the sound got louder, scraping along the floor just inches away. My mind screamed at me to get up, to run, to break the rules and leave, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk it. The scraping stopped suddenly and a cold wave washed over me, the temperature dropping dramatically. I forced myself to move, slowly pushing the covers off and standing up, my feet cold against the floor. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the sound of my breath, shaky and uneven. I turned toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, something inside me hesitated. There was a pressure behind the door, something trying to push its way in. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. I opened the door just a crack and peered into the hallway. The air felt thick again, but nothing was there. Still, I felt as though I wasn't alone. As though something was just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I stepped back inside, my heart racing. I closed the door quietly behind me, locking it for the night. It didn't feel safe here anymore, but the rules kept me bound. The next morning, I greeted the woman in the painting again. She was facing forward this time, but I had this feeling that something had changed. Her eyes seemed darker, deeper, almost alive. But I couldn't let myself focus on it too long. The rules. I had to follow the rules. Days bled into nights, each one more unsettling than the last. I stayed indoors as much as I could, and whenever I passed the painting, I paused to check. She was always facing forward, but I didn't know if it was just the house or if I was beginning to lose my grip on reality. The unease only grew stronger. Then came the night I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, clear. "Is anyone there?" I froze. The voice was familiar, soft, like a grandmother's tone, but something in it made me fear. The hairs on my neck stood up as I stood in the hallway motionless, waiting. The second time it called out, I didn't even hesitate. I turned off all the lights and hid under the covers. I tried to steady my breathing. I didn't hear it a third time. But the next day, the mannequins in the back room were different. Their faces, once blank and lifeless, now looked distorted as if something inside them was pushing out. Their eyes, they were bleeding. I didn't know where to go, my mind fogged up. I could hear movement, the faintest scraping sound from the other side of the room, but when I turned, no one was there. The blood pooled around them, staining the wooden floor beneath. I could feel the seconds ticking by, and every instinct screamed for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The blood from the mannequins dripped steadily, pooling onto the wooden floor in thick, glistening puddles. The air smelled metallic, heavy, suffocating. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, watching the way the crimson liquid seeped from their hollow eye sockets and parted lips as though something inside them was trying to force its way out. I wanted to move, I wanted to step back, but I felt rooted in place, an invisible pressure holding me there. Then, just as the silence stretched to the point of snapping, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak. Not from the mannequins. From the floorboards behind me. I turned instinctively, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The hallway was empty, but something felt wrong. I forced myself to move, to walk forward, my legs unsteady beneath me. The mannequins were still behind me, bleeding, watching. I refused to look back. I went straight to the cleaning supplies, my hands shaking as I grabbed a bucket, rags, anything I could find. I knew I had to act fast. The rule was clear: if I didn't clean up the blood in time, whatever was inside them would break free. The thought made my heart skip a beat, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I returned to the room, forcing myself to kneel beside the mess. The moment I pressed the cloth against the floor, the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel the cold creeping up my arms, needling into my skin, but I didn't stop. The mannequins were still. Their hollow eyes bored into me as I scrubbed, the blood impossibly thick as though the wood itself had absorbed it. The more I wiped, the harder it became to clean, as if the stain was fighting to stay. Then I heard it, a breath. Not mine. It was coming from right beside me. I didn't look up. I couldn't look up. My fingers clenched the cloth, rubbing harder, faster, my own breath hitching in my throat. The breathing continued, slow and steady, too close, far too close. A shadow stretched across the floor beside me, long and twisted, its edges flickering like a dying flame. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs, but I forced myself to keep cleaning, my hands moving on their own. The blood was fading, but the breathing wasn't stopping. I swallowed hard, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The pressure lifted. The air warmed just a little. I stayed crouched there for a moment, my body rigid, my pulse hammering. Then, carefully, I forced myself to look up. The mannequins were normal again. No blood. No movement. Just lifeless figures standing in perfect stillness. I let out a shaky breath, pushing myself up on unsteady legs. I needed to get out of this room. I backed away slowly, my hands still shaking. I turned toward the hallway, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The woman's painting was facing the wrong way again. I nearly tripped over my own feet, catching myself against the doorway. I hadn't gone near the dining room since this morning. There was no reason for her to have moved. And yet, there she was, her head slightly turned, her dark eyes locked onto something beyond the frame, as if she had been watching something move through the house. I turned away immediately. I didn't look back. My hands were clammy as I made my way upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I needed to sleep. I needed to reset my mind, pretend that this was just another night in this cursed house. I shut the door to my room, locking it out of habit. The mansion groaned around me, the wooden walls shifting under their own weight. I told myself it was just an old house settling. I didn't believe it. I lay down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had almost dozed off when I heard it. A muffled, choked sob. I tensed immediately, my entire body stiffening beneath the covers. The sound was coming from the next room. My breath hitched, my mind scrambling. The rule. Rule 5. If you hear someone crying in the next room but know you are alone, you must try to fall asleep or pretend to be asleep immediately, no matter where you are. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to remain still. The crying continued, quiet, fragile. It didn't sound wrong. It sounded human, natural. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breathing slow and measured. The sobs grew louder, trembling with something I couldn't quite name. It felt too close now. The walls were thick, but the sound, it felt as though it were just on the other side of my door. Then the crying stopped. I stayed still, frozen beneath the blanket, my ears straining in the silence. And then I heard the sound of my door handle slowly turning. I stopped breathing. The handle twisted again, a soft click as it shifted under the pressure of something unseen. My fingers dug into the sheets, my heart threatening to betray me. I could feel something standing there, right outside, waiting. The rule echoed in my mind: if it sees you asleep, it won't do anything to you. The door never opened. The presence lingered, then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it. A slow, deliberate shuffle, moving away. I stayed like that until morning. Morning came like a cruel trick, the sunlight thin and cold as it filtered through the curtains. I didn't move at first. I listened. The house was quiet. Not safe, just quiet. I forced myself out of bed, every muscle stiff, my movements slow and careful. I made my way to the dining room. The woman in the painting was waiting. She was back to facing forward, but I hesitated. For a second, I thought her eyes were lower than before, almost as if she were looking down at my feet. But I greeted her anyway, keeping my voice steady. "Good morning." My words barely left my throat, but I made sure she heard them. Then I left the room. I tried to maintain some sense of routine, forcing myself to eat, to move, to pretend I wasn't being suffocated by the weight of this place. But something was different. It wasn't just the silence, it was the feeling of being watched. Not by the painting, not by something in the halls, but by the house itself. As I walked past the long hallway mirror, I stopped. Not because of my reflection, because of something else. A small, wet footprint was just behind me. It hadn't been there before. The footprint was small, childlike, but the shape of it was wrong. It was fresh. The moisture from it gleamed under the dim light. I turned around slowly. Nothing. Just the empty hall. But I could feel it now, something was here. Something I couldn't see. Then the whispering started. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was just there, pressing against my ears like hands over my head. Dozens of voices speaking all at once, hissing, muttering. Some too fast to understand, others too slow, like a word being stretched until it lost its meaning. I backed away. The moment my foot lifted from the floor, the whispering stopped. Silence. Then, from the other end of the hall, something stepped out of the open doorway. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sudden. It just emerged as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. A figure. No features, no details. Just an absence of everything around it, a human shape where no human should be. It was watching me. I didn't move. The rule. If you ever come across a strange figure standing still in your path, do not try to get around them. The moment you do, they will begin to move with you, always a step behind. I couldn't go forward. I couldn't turn back. I was trapped. The figure didn't move. Not yet. It simply stood, its shape wrong, its edges flickering like a candle about to go out. I clenched my fists, my breath coming in shallow pulls. I needed a way out. I needed to think. Then a sound came from the floor above. A dragging noise. Slow. Uneven. Like something heavy being pulled. And it was coming closer. I had no choice. I turned and ran. The moment I did, I felt it move. The presence behind me. A shift in the air. A pressure against my back. I sprinted through the halls. I didn't stop. I reached the stairs, but before I could take the first step, thump. Something hit the ground above me. Hard. I could hear it breathing. No time. No thinking. I ran. I didn't look up. I wouldn't look up. I tore down the corridor, nearly slipping as I turned a corner. The shadows stretched too long, reaching for me. The walls groaned, shifting. The house was moving. I could hear footsteps now. Not mine. Not just one set. Many. Ahead, the dining room. The painting. I lunged inside, heart hammering, slamming into the wall as I turned. She was there. The woman in the painting. But something was wrong. Her head was turned again. But this time she was looking directly at me. My stomach dropped. My mouth went dry. I had followed the rules. I had greeted her, but she had moved anyway. A breath of cold air touched my neck. I turned. Light, not the dim, cold glow of the house's chandeliers, real light. Warm, natural. It flooded in from the front doors, which were wide open. I blinked against it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The oppressive darkness that had been swallowing the house was gone, retreating like a tide. And standing in the doorway were two people. The owners. A man and a woman dressed formally but casually enough to suggest they had just arrived from outside. They looked at me with polite confusion, as if nothing was wrong. As if I hadn't just spent the last few days trapped in a waking nightmare. "Oh," the woman said, glancing around. "You're still here." I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw, my body rigid with lingering terror. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but nothing came out. The man checked his watch. "You were only supposed to stay until this morning. We expected you to be gone by now." Gone? I had been trapped. I had followed their rules, barely survived whatever this place had done to me. And now they stood there, casual, unconcerned, as if none of it had ever happened. The woman gave me a small smile. "You can leave now." I wasn't staying here another second. I forced my legs to move, pushing past them, stepping out onto solid ground. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, the weight lifting, the unseen grip releasing me. The sky was gray, the air crisp. Normal. I turned back, expecting to see the house as it had been, a towering, ancient thing filled with its unnatural presence. But it wasn't. It looked ordinary. Just a grand, historical mansion standing beneath an overcast sky. The man shut the door behind me. "Thank you for your time," he said. The woman nodded. "We'll be in touch if we need another house sitter." I stared at them. Another house sitter? As if what I had been through was just a normal stay? I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but I stopped. Because through the window, just past the sheer curtains, I saw the painting in the dining room. And the woman in the painting was smiling. I left without another word.